Your Excellency, Professor Donner, dear colleagues, dear friends, it's a great honor for me to welcome you on a special occasion here in the Patriotic Hall of Carolinum called Cleveringa Lecture, according to the Professor of Law and Dean of the School of Law in Leiden University. And it's tightly connected to the special day, 21st of November, 1940. It's 78 years ago, when Professor Rudolph Pabus, Dean of the Faculty in Leiden, presented his speech, which is criticized the Nazi decision to discharge his Jewish colleague from the Leiden University. And also students' protests followed, and soon afterwards the university was closed. There are the many similarities between our November, 17th November 1938 years and a few days ago, what's done in Prague due to the protest done 28th of October on the celebrate the National Day of the Czechoslovakia, Day of the Foundation of Czechoslovakia, when the Nazi shooting to the people and one person, Sedláček, and the students of our medical school was died on the 11th of November, and the 15th of November, the funeral, which starting in Albertov, our premises, to follow the body of our students to the railway station. And 2 days ago, 2 days after the Nazi, due to the decision of the Adolf Hitler, closing the Czech universities and killing 9 students, leaders, and 1,200 students transported immediately to the Nazi camp Sachsenhausen. And the 17th November, it is a great date in our history. We celebrate this day as the International Students' Day, which was declared in 1941 in London. And also this day is tightly connected with the freedom and democracy, which is coming on the 50 years anniversary of this suddenly days during the Nazi period in 1989. This is a history, and Patriotic Hall is a place where we discussing with the other colleagues from the universities all around the world the root of the university's principles, and also we discussing on the Rectors' Conference celebrating the 100 years of Czechoslovakia with the call Legacy of the Democracy and Humanism in today's world, when it's participating the colleagues from more than 70 universities all around the world. And we discuss also a role of the universities in this turbulent world, and also a role of the academia connecting to the politics, and also discussing the role of the universities for the future, and also for survive the peace, democracy, and humanism, not only in Europe but all around the world. And we are very honored that this year one of the Cleveringa lectures will be done here in Prague, in Carolinum, which we're discussing with the Excellency of Kingdom of the Netherlands last year. And we are honored that today we should discuss and talk the Cleveringa lectures, which will be done by outstanding person from Netherlands, Dutch politicians and Christian Democrats, which is the holder of the Cleveringa Chair on Leiden University from 2015-2016, Professor Piet Hein Donner. And now I would like to ask His Excellency Kees Kloppenhouwer, the Ambassador of Netherlands, for the few words. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Your Magnificence, Excellencies, Professor Donner. Dear friends, it is a great privilege to be here today in Prague, in the University of the Charles University, which has this tradition as a center of advanced thinking, but also, as you mentioned, Rector, a center for humanism. And Today, it is commonplace to say that the European Union has a lot of challenges, and one of those challenges stand out in particular, and that is the challenge of the rule of law. And I can think of basically no better person from the Netherlands to address this issue. Professor Donner has been a long-standing politician, Minister of Justice, Minister of Social Affairs, also professor at the university, and last but not least, Deputy Chairman of the Council of State. We call him the Vice King of the Netherlands because the King is the Chairman of the Council of State. And the Council of State is an institution that you can compare to a constitutional court, but it is even more than that. So a better authority to address the rule of law than Professor Donner is difficult to find. That's why a great pleasure to introduce him to you. Professor, you have the floor.
Your magnificent excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, just 6 months after the start of the German occupation of the Netherlands in May 1940, the German authorities took the first steps towards isolating the Jewish population in public life. All persons of Jewish ancestry were dismissed from public service. This included the personnel of public universities. On the morning of the 26th of November, today 78 years ago, Professor Edward Meyers, an internationally famous professor in civil law at Leiden University, received his letter of dismissal. That morning, he was scheduled to lecture in the great auditorium of the university. His colleague and former pupils, Professor Cleveringa, took over the lecture and used it to give a laudation of Professor Meyers, in which he protested his dismissal. It ended with the words, "These measures aren't anything but unjust." We had hoped to be spared this kind of justice, but it hasn't been so. For the moment, we cannot but bow before oppression. But in the meantime, we will wait, trust, hope, and believe that he who should stand here will, God willing, in the end return, upon which the audience burst out in the national anthem. His was not the only protest, though there were but a few. Cleveringa, however, hoped that his words would be heard by a lot larger audience than just the students who attended the lecture. At the same time, he expected that they would also be heard by the German authorities. He therefore prepared a small suitcase in readiness for his arrest, which in effect took place shortly afterwards. That is the true measure of civil disobedience, to protest despite the probable consequences, even if they might cost us life and liberty. Prompted by his arrest, students at Leiden University went on strike, which led to the closure of the university by the German authorities for the duration of the German occupation. Cleveringa's words have been preserved for posterity. The same evening, they were copied and circulated to other universities. Over time, they have become an icon of protest against oppression. Since almost 50 years, Cleveringa's protest is annually commemorated by a memorial lecture in the Leiden University Hall. Since a number of years, memorial lectures are also given at other universities. I was honored 3 years ago to be asked to give the memorial lecture in Leiden, and I'm equally honored to speak here today. These memorial lectures are not intended to relive the period of occupation or to reflect on the evils of war and crimes against humanity. It would be even somewhat presumptuous for a Dutchman to come to Prague to speak about occupation and civil courage in a country that has known far more occupation and oppression in recent history than the Netherlands have known in all their history. 2018 is even an iconic year in that respect. It has just been mentioned already. 4 centuries ago, the 30 Years' War started in Prague, which ended in the absorption of Bohemia in the Habsburg Empire. 100 years ago, Czechoslovakia rose from the Austro-Hungarian Empire as an independent nation, but only 20 years later, the European powers that had ratified the rebirth of Czechoslovakia in the Treaty of Versailles started its dismemberment by the Treaty of Munich. And 70 years ago, the short-lived Czech freedom was terminated by the communist coup. Well, 50 years ago, Dubček tried to transform communism, and 25 years ago, Czechoslovakia was peacefully dissolved into the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So it's a miracle that you kept the economy running this past year, despite all the commemorations you had. But Cleveringa's words were not only a protest and a condemnation, they were also meant as a wake-up call for his fellow citizens. The Dutch, at the time, were growing accustomed to the German occupation. Daily life had been hardly disrupted by the change of regime, and they were slowly coming to terms with what appeared to be a new normality. Thus, almost everyone in public service had complied that summer with the order to certify his non-Jewish ancestry, on which the subsequent dismissal in November of Jewish personnel was based. Cleveringa warned, this is not normal. This is injustice. We had hoped to be spared this kind of injustice, but it hasn't been so. The broader message of his words was, we have moral choices to make, even in the face of the inevitable or a seeming new normality. It is this aspect of Cleveringa's words that seem to be relevant in times like ours, in which the world yet again seems to have turned upside down in a short time. Is this a new normality? Though Dubček failed in his attempt to transform communism, he lighted a candle that turned into a slow fire which eventually set all of Eastern Europe ablaze. It started in Poland and ended next year, 30 years ago, in the dramatic flight of East German citizens to the German embassy here in Prague and the fall of the Iron Curtain before the end of the year. In a short time, many countries all over the world transformed into Western-style democracies and market economies. Many former Eastern European states succeeded to the European Union and NATO. Developments that prompted Francis Fukuyama to write his analysis, The End of History and the Last Man, in which he prophesied that both political and economic theory had reached a penultimate stage by the worldwide adoption of democratic, limited government and global markets. Subsequent years seemed to prove him right. National armories were drastically reduced, international organization and multilateralism flourished, Europe adopted a monetary union and started thinking about the adoption of a common constitution. Economies grew worldwide, prompted by the introduction of revolutionary new digital techniques. The turn of the century and the change of millennium seemed to usher in a brave new world of unlimited growth in which the world promised itself by way of the Millennium Goals to eliminate secular social scourges like poverty, hunger, disease, and inequality, and to establish education and health for all, economic development, and environmental sustainability. And yet, within just 10 years, the world once again seems to have turned upside down. The high hopes and common purpose at the start of the century have turned into an inward-looking mood of insecurity, nationalism, loss of confidence in representative democracy, and in popular fears of loss of identity. It started with the attack of 9/11. It was reinforced by subsequent financial crises and resulted in the growth of populism, xenophobia, and an aversion of international commitments. In the past 3 years, this change of mood has resulted in the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, the election of an isolationist president in the United States who is taking apart the multilateral post-war order, the reassertion in China of an autocratic regime, and the appearance in many countries of elected populist parties with a clear antagonism against the rule of law. These are not isolated incidents, but symptoms of a more general swing in the public mood in many countries, a swing that is fueled by the feeling that we have lost control over our lives, over our economies, over our national future. Lost it to elites, Brussels bureaucracies, international liberalism, immigrants, terrorism, or what have you. A feeling one finds not just in a few countries, but almost everywhere nowadays, especially in Europe. It has a fertile breeding ground among growing segments of the electorate that feel they are losing out on social and economic progress, that feel threatened by immigration, terrorism, or loss of identity, or that simply cannot cope with all the complexities of modern digital life. People that have lost faith in traditional political parties and democratic institutions and are ready to support any politician who promises to bring back control and to remedy the social evils that traditional democracy doesn't seem to be able to solve. Politicians that paint a clear black and white picture of society in which the people are victims of clearly identifiable causes and who offer simple solutions, decisive, often aggressive action, and fast results. It is a mood that is not only affecting the growth of populist parties, but is changing the attitude of established political parties as well. Only a few years ago, a member of parliament of the largest of the two ruling parties in the Netherlands proposed a constitutional amendment that would forbid the courts to review the compatibility of national law with international obligations. By that, he targeted in particular the obligations under the European Human Rights Treaty. The proposal didn't get much further, but it is significant that it was allowed to be proposed at all by the ruling Liberal Party. It also goes to show that the feeling of having lost control does not only aim at international commitments and European cooperation, but turns on any institutional restraint that is considered a constraint on what is decided in the name of the people. In that context, the judiciary is often singled out. The interference in Poland and Hungary with judicial independence are but an extreme example. The reaction of President Trump or of Brexiteers to the adverse court decisions with regard to immigration and the ultimate power to decide on Brexit indicate a general animosity towards the courts. In the end, taking back control movement turns on democracy itself. In the Netherlands, the PVV, the Party for Freedom of Mr. Wilders, is a party of only one member, Mr. Wilders himself. And he will keep it that way, to keep control over his movement and its program, in the same way as Mr. Trump wanted to be independent from the Republican Party and managed his election campaign completely on his own. It's symptomatic, I believe, because taking back control in the end also is about control over democratic debate and democratic decision-making. Thus, the attitude of leaders of this movement towards the press, the means they use to influence political opinion by spreading disinformation over the internet and calling fake news any information that doesn't fit in with their opinion, is not a peculiarity, but an expression of a more general attitude towards open society and democratic debate. In the end, if you really believe that you are the expression of the will of the people, any opposition is an opposition to the people and a danger to the common good. It's the reason why some commentators start to speak about the post-democratic era. What we are therefore witnessing is an erosion of the pillars on which social and economic progress in Europe in the past half-century has been founded. Democracy, the rule of law, European cooperation, and rule-based international relations. There seems to be a reinvigorated belief in national power, strong government, and ends that justify means, regardless of the rule of law or international agreement. Should it worry us? Of course, these developments are disconcerting. But since most of them occur elsewhere or on the other side of the world, we won't be able to prevent them, so why bother if they leave us alone? But that is precisely what is not happening. We are involved. In an interdependent world, changes of this kind in one country affect developments elsewhere. Swings in the public mood can easily spill over in other countries. Just think back how communism ended 30 years ago. But these changes affect us also in a very practical way. The impairment of international cooperation and stability affects us all. No national state has the capacity any longer to meet on its own the challenges that face modern society. Challenges of global warming, limited natural resources, growing social differences, security threats, or the risks of a digitized society. Taking back control in one country therefore has consequences in other states. The withdrawal of the United States from the Paris agreements and the denial of global warming as a problem are a good example. The denial is logical. The recognition that there is a problem would imply that it cannot be solved by the US alone. But I can assure you that it feels pretty scary in a country like mine, where the lowest point is 7 meters below the sea level at the present moment, even if the Netherlands would fulfill all their obligations by tomorrow, most of the country will still drown in the coming century if other countries don't do their share. Likewise, the capacity of a state to protect its citizens against criminality, terrorism, security threats, and the risks of a digitized society is severely curtailed if others don't cooperate. Economic and social prospects are affected. Brexit doesn't just damage the British economy. Moreover, it is not just prosperity and stability that are at stake, but open society and cultural diversity and the rule of law itself. Taking back control implies a system of international relations in which relations between states are governed by might instead of right. It fuels a constant rivalry between states and the search for advantages at the expense of other states. But governments that are in constant rivalry with their neighbors in order to increase their international influence will need political unity and social conformity instead of democratic and cultural diversity. Economic interests and fears of popular majorities will therefore easily take precedence over individual rights, ethnic diversity, and the interest of minorities. Tendencies that have been kept at bay by common purpose, mutual trust, and common institutions of the rule of law, the European courts, the charters, and the European legal order. The rule of law in individual member states of the European Union is nowadays anchored in that cooperation, but it runs the risk of being among the first victims if states revert to national autonomy. Even in the United Kingdom, it seems as if the single most important issue for the Brexiteers is how to get away from under the jurisdiction of the court in Luxembourg. The effects of what I call taking back control movement in some countries affect development elsewhere, especially within the European Union. And yet, we often take hardly notice of these developments or even feel sympathies for countries that assert their own democratic choices against Brussels. Take, for example, the current debate between the European Commission and Italy about its budget. At least in the Netherlands, one hardly reads or hears about it, even though it might result in a crisis worse than the Greek crisis. Should we see these developments in a more detached way, as a phenomena of a changing democratic majority in reaction to a new reality? Feelings of loss of control seem warranted. Aren't we losing control to anonymous markets, internet providers, boardrooms, councils, bureaucracies? Isn't there a democratic gap in the structure of the European Union? And shouldn't we admit that the assumptions on which the idea of European integration was built are no longer valid? Isn't the free movement of persons fueling xenophobia, discrimination, and intolerance, instead of integration and understanding? And isn't it facilitating criminality and terrorism in Europe? Shouldn't we admit that free trade, global markets, economic growth are no longer promoting social integration by spreading wealth and income, but instead concentrating wealth and the means of production in the hands of a few? In 2017, the world grew richer by $9,000 billion, but 82% of that ended up in the pockets of just 1% of the world population. Though the increase in inequality in Europe is low compared to other continents, it is increasing, and not so much between member states as within member states. Moreover, it should be noted that in most countries, except maybe China, these changes are brought about by popular vote in democratic elections. Aren't we therefore witnessing the adaptation of society to new challenges by democratic process and the rise of a new normality, with which we will have to learn to live? We are, of course, faced with a course of events that result from electoral processes we cannot alter. To that extent, we find ourselves in the same situation in which Cleveringa found himself. For the moment, we cannot but bow. We have to bow before the facts as they are. But even if they become normal in a factual way, they shouldn't be accepted as normal in a moral way, as a norm we ought to conform to, because they are not. They constitute an erosion of the fundaments of an open democratic society. To accept them as norm would therefore betray the values our fathers and grandfathers fought for, because what is presented as a new normality is but a relapse in an older normality, the normality of autonomous states, more or less authoritarian regimes, and an anarchic international society. It completely ignores a new reality of a digitized world without frontiers, of increasingly interdependent societies, the ineffectiveness of border controls, and the diminishing capacity of national states to cope on their own with the challenges of modern society. A new reality that requires commitment, cooperation, and a common rule of law. What is presented as taking back control is in effect losing control, in particular with regard to the very real problems of growing social inequality, mass migration, and security. The arguments for taking back control rest in most cases on three fundamental misconceptions. The first is the suggestion of an antithesis between national autonomy and European cooperation. In a growing number of member states, political debate is drawn into this antithesis. If only we would be able to make our own choices, so runs the argument, instead of having to apply the dictates of Brussels, all would be manageable. But it's a false antithesis. The originality of the European construction was and is that member states and the Union mutually reinforce each other. The driving force behind the European project is not an ambition for power, but the increasing awareness of the loss of power by national states in the face of international markets and intensive cross-border contacts. Internal border controls were not abolished in order to promote cross-border movement, but because they had become ineffectual and outmoded in the face of the intensity of interstate traffic. Take European cooperation away, and these shortcomings and limitations will soon reappear. They even show up now. It has been calculated that due to interstate rivalry and tax evasion, the 10 largest multinationals pay now 9% less taxes than they did in 2008 before the crisis. Social and economic inequality grows faster within the separate member states than between them. Yet, no member state has found an effective answer, which is logical given the fact that it involves managing markets that are per se transnational. Likewise, terrorists are often native or long-term immigrants from the member states in which they act. Restoration of border controls only creates an illusion of safety because criminality nowadays uses the internet that knows no borders. Sovereignty is a hollow concept in a world where each state is dependent on others for its prosperity, security, and viability of policies. Reasserting national autonomy will not solve anything, but only adversely affect the capacity of both the Union and its member states to cope with the challenges of modern society. If European cooperation would disappear, it will not result in the reappearance of viable national states, but in a general impotence and the marginalization of European states. A second misconception consists in opposing multilateralism and national interests and autonomy. It is the thinking that is behind the withdrawal of the United States from a number of treaties, the refusal of China to comply with the decisions of the International Court of Justice, but it is also behind the negative outcome in the Netherlands of a referendum on the Ukraine Association Agreement. These moves result in a steady erosion of a system of international relations based on right instead of might, which is another way of losing control, especially for smaller states. That is why big powers favor a weakening of international law in general and of the European Union in particular. They know they will have more influence in bullying individual states than negotiating with them unitedly. It is the thinking that rests on a concept of international relations as a zero-sum game, in which one's profit is always at the expense of others. In that concept, multilateralism will always be at the expense of the most powerful, which is the reason why bilateral deals are preferred. It is a concept that favors short-term windfalls for the few over long-term stability and prosperity for all. It ignores completely that democracy and economic growth, as we know it, are based on a concept of society as a non-zero-sum system, in which all can benefit from cooperation, trust, and rules. It's the rule of law that enables that transformation, and that is why constitutional law and legislation are never considered to be opposed to freedom, but rather as a necessary precondition for it. A third misconception consists in the belief that bringing politics closer to the grassroots is giving back control. It has been the thinking behind much constitutional innovation in Europe in the past decades. Innovations like decentralization, referenda, lowering electoral thresholds, making offices elective. Though the devolution of powers is an answer to local and regional differences, it's not an effective answer to the need of control. Though through devolving powers can give more control over smaller entities, it diminishes control over larger entities and social activities on a national and transnational scale. They automatically increase the blocking power of passionate minorities, particular interest groups, and not in my backyard sentiments, with the result that necessary measures and initiatives get blocked. Referenda are nowadays often used to overcome these blockades, but they equally tend to favor the same minorities' interests and sentiments. That is why in a recent study it shows that moves to bring electoral power closer to the grassroots increase overall dissatisfaction with democratic performance instead of decreasing it. Thus, the choices that force themselves upon the political agenda are not about more or less European or international cooperation, or giving back power to the political grassroots. In the end, they concern the secular question: do we trust in the process of law, or do we trust in processes of force to get results? Force often looks attractive because it appears to be so much more effective in obtaining results than democratic and legal processes. And one shouldn't immediately think about physical force, violence, or killing. Think of the other ways in which pressure, intimidation, threatening language can get things done and obtain results without having to comply with all these established procedures and rules. Think how one can force the issue by creating accomplished facts without waiting for the outcome of the legal processes, or how one can circumvent rules, procedures, and checks to get results. It often starts innocuously, but since proposals are based on a rough black and white analysis, and solutions are kept simple, proposed measures tend to get more aggressive and can easily end up with threatening individuals, minorities, or essential public interests. To find examples, one needn't look at the usual suspects abroad, because we often have them at hand in our own countries. In the Netherlands, Mr. Wilders has, as a member of parliament, submitted a proposed bill to determine by act of parliament that the Islam is no longer considered to be a religion, that all religious objects like the Quran and mosques are forbidden, and that Muslims are to be considered to be terrorists. It is but a more extreme example of the proposals by which populist politicians nowadays try to outbid each other to get attention and to show their firmness, radicalism, and willingness to obtain results. And the most disconcerting fact is that it gets them attention and rises their popularity. It could, of course, be objected that such a proposal, if enacted, would become part of the process of the law. The distinction between law and force, therefore, would seem to be a matter of form and not of substance. But on the contrary, the proposal marks the difference between the two processes, because it could only be enacted by abolishing major constitutional guarantees. Constitutionalism and the limitation of powers of government is an essential part of the process of the law. Constitutionalism is not just having a written constitution. It consists of the whole set of institutions that guarantee freedom, constitute the government, and limit the exercise of governmental powers. The rule of law is an essential part of it, which includes nowadays a number of human rights treaties. Thus, the proposal to outlaw Islam lists a number of treaties that will have to be revoked by the Netherlands in order to make the law applicable. Rest assured, the proposal is in clear conflict with the Dutch constitution and will never pass. But it's not really meant to pass. Its objective is to contribute to a climate of menace and fear. That is why it is a symptom of the use of force. A choice for the process of the law implies a choice for democracy. Democracy and the rule of law are inseparable. But in that context, democracy must be distinguished from majority rule. It's another modern misconception that the two are identical, a misconception that is at the root of many conflicts of populist majorities with the rule of law and the courts. After all, so they think, the majority is the sum total of democracy that legitimizes the ends and justifies the means. Though the adoption of the proposed outlawing of Islam by a majority would make it an act, it doesn't make it a democratic measure. Democracy is not about imposing majority rule, but about living together in peace in a plural society with many different interests, opinions and beliefs. It's about respecting minority views, taking account of diverse interests, protecting individual rights, and offering room to everyone to live according to his deepest convictions. It therefore requires tolerance, respect, understanding, and solidarity. Of course, majority decision can be necessary to codify agreements or to decide if other means to convince prove to be inconclusive. Do we trust the process of the law or the process of force? That is the choice before us. And it is a choice each of us will have to make. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, Burke once said. It's not a choice whether or not to do something about the feeling that we are losing control, or about taking serious the social economic anxieties of a growing number of people. These concerns should be taken serious. Nor is it a choice for or against government power. Power is necessary to preserve order, to protect freedom, to bring about changes. Pascal once wrote, "It is right to follow justice. It is necessary to follow the mighty. Justice without might is helpless. Might without justice is tyrannical. We must therefore combine justice and might, and to that end make what is just mighty, and what is mighty just." That is the choice before us, whether we trust might or combine it with justice, which is the idea of constitutionalism, and thereby turn might into legitimate power. The challenge before us is how to combine justice, power, and democratic legitimacy in a Europe of interdependent states. Questions of European cooperation, the rule of law, and democracy can no longer be separated. Interdependence makes national democracy dependent on European cooperation for its performance. To function, European cooperation depends on the rule of law in the member states. And democracy and the rule of law are at all levels mutually dependent. There's much room for improvement, but improvement does not start with tearing down what has been painstakingly been built up, but by renovating it, unless you want a completely new house to live in. I just said the challenge before us, and used the term us on purpose. We are in this together. We cannot solve these questions separately, each in our own context, because as long as we debate and decide them in our own national framework, the likely outcome will be reasonable, do it my way. It is a sure recipe for growing dissatisfaction and will lead to a closing of minds along national borders, a closing that is growing upon us already, the feeling that there is no real willingness on the other side to understand our motives. Tolerance, mutual respect, solidarity, and understanding are values that do not stop at national borders. But we often hardly know each other's positions and the motives for differing views. For information, we are dependent on often rather stereotype or partisan information from media or the internet. Maybe universities should take a larger role in organizing an informed debate in other member states. But we don't have much time to decide these questions. Structural differences in the level of work, income, health and education are increasing. As said, economic growth is segregating and not integrating any longer. Growing numbers of people are losing out. According to a news report this week, the number of people in Italy living in poverty has gone up in 10 years from 1.8 million to 5. Understandably, people feel betrayed in their trust in a social system that offers them no perspective for improvement. A disenchantment that is easily exploited by populist politicians and turned against European cooperation as it is associated with free markets and free movement. At the same time, we are growing ever more interdependent and therefore more dependent on European cooperation to find protection against the effect of global markets. The same goes for a number of other vital issues. European cooperation is not part of the problem as an unwarranted restriction on national policy, but the instrument to solve the many challenges we face in a modern society. We can be in control, but only if we cooperate. We are therefore in a fix. Our main support in dealing with these challenges, the European Union is fast losing electoral support in the member states. Now, far be it from me to suggest that this is the only or even the main question we are faced with. There is room for improvement at all levels, national and European. The disenchantment occurs everywhere and is often primarily directed against national aspects of democracy and the rule of law. But European cooperation is as yet not irreversible. Brexit has put a stop to that illusion. European cooperation is therefore the most vulnerable of the three. It is clear that the European Union, in its present condition, has difficulty in proving it can provide adequate protection and support and thereby stem the tide of anti-European feeling. There are a number of characteristics that work in its disfavor, such as the lack of a clear political center of gravity. Decision-making in the Union is a mixture of intergovernmental negotiation and majority voting, which makes for a diffuse system of political responsibility. But though there is much room for improvement, the last thing the Union needs now is a new round of debate on the structure of the Union. It will be to no avail and is much more likely to further divide public opinion and harden positions. What the Union needs now is results, not discussion. On the other hand, as member states become more dependent on each other for vital services and government functions like defense, security, energy, they will need more guarantees that no member state can at any moment unilaterally withdraw its cooperation. Cooperation with regard to government functions will have to be both reliable and irreversible, which means that the means, the capacity to act, and the agility to react will have to be assured. And that implies that decision-making cannot depend on consent by each individual member state. It would run the risk of getting stuck in a moment of crisis. To put it the other way around, the more member states insist on decisions requiring the consent of all or of a large majority, the less stable and robust cooperation will be, and the less effective member states will be in meeting the challenges they face. Improving the capacity of the Union and member states to meet the challenges of modern society and to stem the rise of anti-European feeling, therefore, comes down to improving its capacity to decide and to act. Two other aspects are often raised in that context: democratic accountability and room for national diversity. Democratic accountability, or the lack of it, so-called democratic gap, is nowadays often identified as one of the causes of anti-European feelings and one of the reasons why decision-making cannot be improved. It can, however, be argued that the European decision-making suffers from democratic overkill. There are at least 4 organs that claim to be the source of democratic legitimacy: the European Parliament, the European Council, the Council of Ministers, and national parliaments. The lack of clear democratic accountability is mainly due to the diffuse system of decision-making. National history shows that the effective democratic accountability requires centralization of powers. The discussion on democratic accountability in the Union is therefore begging the question of decision-making. More room for national diversity and derogation has also been suggested as a possible way out of the dilemma between reinforcing decision-making by the Union and national fear of losing out, or of losing control. European rules should limit themselves to defining the objectives and the most important norms, but leave the realization to national legislators. It's interesting to note that this was precisely the original concept of the directive. Right from the start, however, there was strong pressure to formulate directives as precise as possible for fear of creating trade obstacles or market distortions. Even now, directives sometimes leave room to impose stricter national requirements. But it is a possibility that is hardly ever used for fear of disadvantaging the national economy. It shows that if mechanisms exist that will confront member states with the cost of what they are doing, there needn't be a problem. If such self-correcting mechanisms are, however, lacking, and correction depends on bureaucratic control and judicial decision mechanisms, the system won't work. Correction will then involve political confrontation, and the larger the deviation, the bigger the confrontation and the stronger the political power that will be needed to correct the offending member state. Just think of the current confrontation over the Italian budget. Though the discussion on decision-making power of the European Union is a minefield of conflicting interests, the issue will have to be taken up if we are serious in the commitment to the process of law against force. One thing, moreover, should be clear. Whatever the solution that will be found, it will depend on the application of the rule of law and the principle of judicial independence in all member states. European cooperation is to a large extent a juridical construct that depends on the certainty that non-compliance by a member state will be corrected by its own judiciary. If that fails, cooperation will cease. It's similar to what happened in the banking system in the crisis of 2008. At a certain moment, banks were no longer sure that other banks would repay their loans. At that moment, all traffic between banks stopped, and the whole system was on the verge of imploding. That is why the European Commission is right in taking action against member states for any infringement on the rule of law and judicial independence, and should be supported in that action by all member states. Your Magnificence, ladies and gentlemen, all things come to an end, even this lecture. We are living in troubled times, and we are witnessing a disturbing change of mood in national and international politics. It gives rise to a new kind of politicians that promise to bring back control and to remedy social problems that traditional democracy doesn't seem able to solve. They offer simple solutions, decisive and often aggressive action, and fast results, and thereby are appealing to people that are losing any perspective for improvement. It is a development that should worry us. It shouldn't be accepted as the rise of a new democratic normality, as a norm we should respect and eventually conform to, because it is not. It's a betrayal of the values our fathers and grandfathers fought for. It will not bring back control, but lose it instead. The political aims of this movement imply a steady erosion of the pillars on which social and economic progress in the past half-century were founded and on which our future ought to be based. Democracy, the rule of law, European cooperation, and a rule-based international relations. The thinking behind this movement is based on fundamental misconceptions with regard to European cooperation, the notion of democracy, and the essence of the rule of law. In the end, the choice before us is not about taking back control, but is the sector choice whether we will trust in the process of the law or in the process of force. The last will always appear to be much more effective and quicker in obtaining results. At first, they will seem to be innocuous compared to the results, but they will become more aggressive to obtain the more difficult results. Europe has been down that road before. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. We do have a choice, and it is a choice each of us has to make, actively or passively. I repeat, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It is, however, not just a choice against one road. It will also require commitment to follow the other, because that one is in urgent need of repair. It's not a question of improving the rule of law, democracy, or European cooperation in turn. The three have become intricately entwined, and improvements are not separable. It's about the governance of Europe and a choice between governance by right or might. It's not a choice that can be left to governments and politics. That's what we have been doing far too long. We thought that once democracy and the rule of law were established, they would take care of themselves. And that once the process of European cooperation had got going, Europe would realize itself on its own because of the self-evident logic and benefits. That has been another misconception. They all require constant attention and effort. In the end, democracy, the rule of law, European cooperation are not questions of institutions, but of an attitude and personal commitment by citizens. The Americans have a saying, if it's to be, it's up to me, meaning that it all starts with our personal attitude, personal commitment, and personal effort. Democracy starts with the daily effort to live together in a plural society. The rule of law starts with the observance of the spirit, not with control. European cooperation starts with the recognition that it is part of the solution of the challenges we face, part of the protection people are looking for, and part of the guarantee of an open society and the rule of law. That should be our commitment in the hope of securing for future generations a European society where we can live in peace and security in all our diversity, where everyone has the perspective of a better future, and where there is room for each of us to live according to his deepest convictions. Hope, in the sense as was once defined by Václav Havel. Hope is a state of mind. It's not the joy that things are going well or willingness to invest in enterprises that are obviously heading for success, but rather an ability to work for something because it is good. Hope is not optimism. It's not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turned out. Thank you.
Well, Professor Donner, thank you very much for your lecture. I think we still have time for a couple of questions, and I believe there are those brave enough to ask questions now. So I will now ask you to raise your hands if you would like to pose a question. Otherwise, there's plenty of time to speak later during the reception, but please do continue the debate if you wish so. Gentleman in the back. Just wait for your mic and introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Jan Lukács and I'm from Young Populars. My question is, you said that the decentralization is, let's say, one of the banes of the ruling of European Union. I'm sorry for not quoting you. How do you mean that? Is decentralization bad? I understand there has to be some central government, but I think the decentralization and subsidiarity are the one of the main principles of the European Union. Thank you very much.
I wanted to indicate that when we are talking about democratic accountability of the European Union, there's always talk about the democratic gap. But I think that that is the result of how the system of deciding is organized. And I said that our national history shows that the real democratic accountability came about by centralizing powers. If you don't centralize them, you can't expect that you have a clear democratic accountability. On the other hand, I stressed that something has to be done about the capacity of the Union to act, because otherwise member states won't be able to act as well. So it remains a cooperative, diffuse system in all probability, but in which the Union must have more capacity to act.
Thank you very much. Unless there are any other questions, yes, gentlemen here, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Kvile. I am the ambassador of Norway. Well, even if the European Union faces certain challenges, or perhaps the idea behind the European Union faces certain challenges, the European Union plays a very important role in European politics. It's very attractive for those outside, even for Norway, even if we have decided to stay outside. Economically, Norway is, for all practical purposes, a member of the European Union. But my point is about something I observed during my 5 years as the OSCE ambassador of Norway in Vienna. Many countries outside the European Union in Europe would like to become a member. And the European Union requires certain standards when it comes to democracy, rule of law. And what I think I observed in Vienna was that therefore the European Union plays an important role in inspiring countries, for example in the Balkans, for having ambitions when it comes to rule of law and democracy. And Professor, if you can have a comment on that, if my observation makes any sense, thank you very much.
No, I do agree with you that that is also one of the main functions and influences the European Union has. But that is precisely the reason why the European Union must also have the powers and possibility to correct afterwards, when a country has become a member, if there are infringements on the rule of law. Because otherwise it's just a question of getting in and then doing what you want. So it stresses the point that on that point I think the European Commission is correct in acting against Poland on a matter of judicial independence.
I do see a hand over there, lady over there.
Professor, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very impressive, and it gave me some hope. I'm Josephine Forman from Postbellum, which is a non-governmental non-profit organization. I just have a question, because today we speak about the crisis of democracy, but I feel, talking also to the students of law, sometimes there is also a discussion about the crisis of law, and you many times mentioned the crisis, the rule of law, as one of the general and very important bricks, and on which makes all the enterprise of democracy. So could you comment? What does law mean for you today, primarily? Thank you.
If you want to have another lecture.
Of course, I know this is a complex one, but
that's what I try to indicate, that law is more than just a rule that is enacted by a majority. It is also, it must have an internal value on trying to equilibrate the different interests problems that are. That's why it is a democratic measure, not just by imposing the position of a majority on a minority, but trying to solve for common problems, find rules. So that is why I'm saying the rule of law is not just judicial independence and is not just an enactment, but it's a whole set of constitutional institutions and requirements. But in the end, that was my conclusion, it ends up with the personal commitment of the citizens. Because if they accept it, then anything will go.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much.
But I really don't have a very concise definition of what is law.
Sorry, I didn't even expect that. Thank you for your comment. To me, was important what you said, but I just wanted to maybe later continue with the discussion if you might be interested. But I just wanted to stress that there are many laws coming out of the European Union, and sometimes I feel, or just comes to my mind, how the multiplicity of the laws might come with terms with the individualism that we are.
Of course, the law has been influenced also by the whole individualism that has arisen. There's also a point that we use the term law for a whole set of different kinds of rules. The French Constitution has a nice distinction making between rules, technical rules, or general measures that are taken, and the law, which they consider by the civil law. So there isn't. The danger is that simply because we call everything law, we think that all is permitted under the law. And that's why I'm saying I can't give you a concise definition.
No, thank you very much, Professor. I now give the floor to His Magnificent Rector.
Dear Professor Donner, dear colleagues, thank you very much for your excellent lecture here. And I believe that it's the ideas of your speech about the democracy, humanism, law, also the insight of each of us, and also the importance of the European Common Platform will go out of this lecture hall through us, and I think it will be very important in the next spring will be the election to the European Parliament, because it is the main body of the exact law in the Europe, and I think that we must do as much possible to inform about the importance of this democratic principles for its 100 years in the Europe coming, and it's very important not only for the university and for all society. Thank you once again to coming here, and also for an excellent lecture. And me and your Excellency Ambassador would like to invite all of you for a small reception in the representative areas, and also we should continue the discussion. Thank you very much.